Her mascara trembled before the first tear fell. Pam Bondi's face, so often the polished mask of certainty, now wavered in front of millions. The room froze. Chairs stopped creaking. Pens stopped scratching. Even whispers seemed to dissolve in the air. For a moment, Congress itself felt like a theater, every camera lens zooming in to catch the instant when power cracked under the weight of one question. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't pound the table. She simply leaned in, eyes steady, and let silence do what shouting never could. The contrast was electric, one woman unraveling, the other glowing with an almost regal calm. Viewers watching at home leaned closer to their screens. What could she have possibly asked to shake someone like Pam Bondi to the core? The question lingered like a thunderclap that refuses to fade. Bondi's lips moved, searching for a defense, but the words came out jagged, hesitant, broken. A hand rose instinctively toward her face, as if she could shield herself from the judgment that now felt inescapable. Crockett, meanwhile, didn't gloat. She waited. Composed, it was the patience of someone who knew the truth was on her side, and that sooner or later it would surface. And then came the word that hung over everything, Epstein. Not just a name, but a shadow cast across America's corridors of wealth and influence. The files. The flights, the secrets people in power prayed would never see the light of day. That was the fault line Crockett had just stepped on. And the tremor was already spreading. Pam Bondi, once untouchable, now appeared fragile, human-cornered. Crockett, standing firm, became more than a congresswoman in that instant. She became a vessel for every American demanding that the wealthy and powerful answer for what they've hidden. The chamber seemed to hold its breath as though the walls themselves knew that a moment like this would echo far beyond Capitol Hill. But to understand this moment, we must rewind to the tension that built up before the tears. The hearing was billed as routine. Another day, another panel, another stack of papers thick with legal jargon that most Americans would never bother to read. Cameras rolled, staffers shifted in their seats, and the official language of Washington filled the air like static. On the surface, it was business as usual. But just beneath that dull, bureaucratic exterior, something volatile was pulsing, waiting to erupt. Because this was not just a hearing, it was a pressure cooker. And at its center sat Pam Bondi, a woman whose career had been built on polished statements, political maneuvering, and the confidence that power protects its own. She came into the room expecting to leave untouched, her words tucked neatly into the congressional record like stones sinking to the bottom of a pond. What she didn't expect was Jasmine Crockett, a woman who had no intention of letting those stones stay buried. The stakes could not have been higher. This wasn't simply about two women exchanging barbs in front of the nation. It was about something far more dangerous, the credibility of America's justice system itself. For years, the whispers around Jeffrey Epstein's files had haunted the country. Who knew what, who covered for whom, and why did accountability always seem to stop just short of the powerful? Every time the public asked those questions and heard silence in return, faith in the system eroded. Pam Bondi represented that silence, a figurehead for the politics of avoidance, the politics of distraction, the politics of pretending that corruption can be smoothed over with a calm voice and a confident smile. To let her glide through this hearing unscathed would mean telling Americans once again that the truth is reserved for the few, not for the many. But Jasmine Crockett was different. She wasn't there to rehearse lines or play by the unspoken rules of protecting colleagues. She was there to expose, to challenge, to speak the words everyone else in the room seemed too afraid to say. In her voice carried the frustration of a public that had been strung along for years, told to wait, told to trust, told that justice was coming even as evidence piled up that justice was being buried. The question Crockett was about to ask wasn't just about Pam Bondi. It wasn't even just about Epstein. It was about the very soul of American justice. Would this country continue to shield its elite from accountability? Or would someone finally rip away the curtain and force the system to look itself in the mirror? That's why the moment mattered. That's why the air felt heavier, the silence sharper, the sense of inevitability stronger with each passing second. When Crockett leaned forward, the cameras leaned in too. Millions of Americans watching at home could feel it in their bones something was about to shift. And once asked, there would be no going back. To see why this mattered so deeply, you need to understand the woman on trial in the court of public opinion. To understand why Pam Bondi's unraveling mattered, you have to know the history she carried in that room. For years, Bondi was the picture of polished authority. The former Attorney General of Florida, a woman who built her brand on toughness, charm, and an aura of untouchable confidence. She could smile into a camera while deflecting the most piercing questions, glide past reporters with rehearsed ease, and command a courtroom as if it were a stage. To many, she was the golden face of Republican power in the South, articulate, telegenic, always camera ready, but beneath that sheen was a career littered with controversy. As Florida's top law enforcement officer, she often projected the image of a defender of justice. Yet critics saw something else, a protector of privilege. Allegations surfaced about her reluctance to pursue cases that threatened political allies, her willingness to look the other way when money and influence hung in the balance. When questions were raised about Trump University defrauding students, Bondi's office declined to investigate just days after her political committee received a hefty donation from Donald Trump himself. To the average citizen, it reeked of pay to play politics. To the elite, it was business as usual. Her ties to Trump grew stronger in the years that followed. She became a loyal defender, appearing on television to spin scandals into nothing, to dismiss investigations as witch hunts, to shield not only Trump, but the broader culture of immunity that swirled around him. And so, when whispers tied her orbit to the dark fog of Epstein, it struck a familiar chord. Here was another figure in power, another gatekeeper, another smiling face telling Americans not to ask too many questions. Bondi's presence in the hearing room that day was more than symbolic. She carried with her the weight of every headline that suggested corruption could be papered over with charisma, every moment when the powerful escaped scrutiny while ordinary people paid the price. She walked in with the same confidence she always did, chin high, voice steady, an expression that said, "I've survived worse than this." And in the early exchanges, she lived up to that reputation. Her tone was cool, even dismissive, as if the committee's questions were beneath her. She smiled politely, deflected artfully, and spoke with the rhythm of someone who believed she could control the narrative. It was the arrogance of a veteran who had silenced critics before and fully expected to do it again. But arrogance has a way of leaving cracks. Watch closely, and you could see them, the tightness in her jaw when Epstein's name was mentioned, the flicker in her eyes when references to elite networks began to surface, the subtle hitch in her breath when asked about connections she swore didn't exist. These were not the tells of someone in complete control. They were the tells of someone who knew that the truth, if dragged into the light, could scorch her carefully built image. Pam Bondi had made a career out of standing between the public and the powerful, insulating the latter from accountability. But the longer she spoke, the clearer it became that she was also standing on a cliff edge, one wrong step away from a plunge that no charm could rescue her from. And the committee, the press, the nation watching, they all sensed it. In that moment, Bondi embodied the archetype of the villain Americans know too well, polished on the outside, corroded on the inside. She was the voice of privilege, insisting nothing was wrong, the hand of power waving away scandal, the smile that hid rot. Every word she uttered sounded less like reassurance and more like denial. Every gesture seemed designed to hold back a tide that was already rising. But across from her sat a very different force, one prepared to pierce through every layer of denial. Long before she ever set foot in Congress, Jasmine Crockett understood what it meant to fight uphill battles. Born and raised in St. Louis, she carried the story of a family that knew hard work, sacrifice, and the bruises of injustice. She wasn't handed power, and she didn't inherit influence. What she inherited was grit, the kind of determination forged in communities where people had to scrap for every inch of dignity they could keep. Her journey to public life was never about climbing ladders for prestige. It was about standing up when others were pushed down, first as a civil rights and criminal defense attorney, she fought in crowded courtrooms where the odds were stacked against the powerless. She defended those written off by the system, those who didn't have the wealth or connections to tip the scales in their favor. For every case she argued, she saw the same story play out. The privileged got excuses, the poor got sentences. And it carved into her a conviction that justice couldn't simply be preached. It had to be wrestled from those who hoarded it. That conviction pulled her into politics, first in Texas and then onto the national stage. Elected to Congress, Crockett carried the same fire she had shown in court. She didn't soften her edges for Washington. She didn't bend her spine to fit in with those who preferred silence. She arrived loud, fearless, and unwilling to play the game of polite cover-ups. In her very first months, she built a reputation as one of the chamber's most fiery defenders of truth, a woman unafraid to take on anyone, Republican or Democrat, who thought they could bulldoze over the values she represented. But what made Crockett stand out was not just her sharp tongue or her relentless questioning. It was her dignity. In hearings where others shouted, she could bring the room to silence with a single measured pause. In exchanges where others let anger spill, she delivered her words with a precision that cut deeper than any raised voice. She was a firebrand, yes, but a firebrand with control, one who knew how to let the flames illuminate rather than consume. And that balance made her dangerous to the establishment because she wasn't speaking just for herself. Every time she leaned into the microphone, she carried with her the voices of every immigrant family who sacrificed everything for a chance at fairness, every working class American who felt the system was rigged against them, every young person demanding a government that didn't protect predators and crooks while punishing the powerless. She gave those voices weight in a chamber designed to ignore them. That's why, when Crockett faced off against Pam Bondi, the stakes felt different. This wasn't a clash of personalities. It was a clash of worlds. Bondi represented the polished shield of power, the smile that protected corruption. Crockett represented raw truth, sharpened by lived struggle, wrapped in the armor of dignity. To watch them sit across from one another was to watch America's ongoing fight over whose voices truly matter. Her supporters often said Jasmine Crockett had the gift of turning truth into a weapon. Not a weapon of destruction, but of exposure. When she questioned someone, she wasn't simply trying to score points. She was trying to peel back the layers to show the public what lay beneath. And that was precisely what terrified figures like Bondi. Because when Crockett asked a question, it wasn't about her. It was about every American who'd been stonewalled, silenced, or lied to. She had trained her entire life for that role. The late nights preparing cases no one thought she could win. The hostile opponents who tried to shout her down in court. The moments when she was told she was too young, too black, too fiery, too unpolished to make it in politics. Each time, she proved them wrong, not by bending herself into their mold, but by standing firmer in her own. By the time she arrived in Congress, she was not just a representative. She was a force. And so when Crockett prepared to take her shot at Pam Bondi, she did not approach it like a mere political sparring match. She approached it like a reckoning. The question she held was more than a query in a committee hearing. It was the culmination of every battle she'd fought, every truth she defended, every voice she'd carried. It was the weight of history pressing forward through her, aimed squarely at the polished armor of a woman who thought she could not be touched. That is why the moment felt inevitable, why the room's silence seemed to stretch before she even spoke. Every path in Crockett's story had led to this clash. Every injustice she'd witnessed had sharpened this blade. When her eyes locked on Bondi, it wasn't just one congresswoman confronting another political figure. It was the embodiment of accountability facing the avatar of corruption. And so, when the two finally clashed, the silence before her words was deafening. The chamber was supposed to be sterile. Fluorescent lights, polished wood, cameras humming in quiet vigilance. But the moment Jasmine Crockett leaned into her microphone, the atmosphere turned electric. Across from her, Pam Bondi adjusted her blazer with that well-rehearsed composure of someone who had weathered scrutiny before. She smiled, faint and dismissive, as though Crockett's questions were beneath her. Bondi began with deflection. She leaned on talking points layered in practiced charm. Congresswoman, with all due respect, this hearing is not the place for personal speculation, she said, her voice honeyed but rigid. Her words carried the subtle arrogance of someone used to controlling the room. But Crockett wasn't blinking. Her eyes locked on Bondi, unflinching, steady as stone. When Bondi tried to sidestep, Crockett narrowed her questions, slicing away the exits one by one. This isn't speculation, Miss Bondi, she countered, her tone sharp but composed. This is about accountability, and accountability doesn't wait for permission. The murmurs began then, quiet ripples of reaction spreading across the chamber. Staffers shifted in their seats. Journalists scribbled faster. Even some members of Congress sat up straighter, sensing that this was not going to be a routine exchange. Bondi's jaw tightened. Her voice, usually smooth, began to quiver at the edges. She raised her chin, trying to project authority, but the cracks were visible. Congresswoman, I am here to answer questions about my professional record, not to entertain conspiracy theories. She pressed, leaning into her own microphone, her words sharpened in defense. Crockett didn't flinch. Her fire came not from volume, but from precision. Every phrase was measured, each syllable carrying weight. Conspiracy theories don't make people cry, Bondi, she said evenly. But truth has that effect. Gasps echoed softly across the room. A few heads turned instinctively toward Bondi, whose polished confidence was slipping. She shifted in her chair, her eyes darting briefly before snapping back to Crockett, trying to hold the stare. But Crockett's gaze was immovable, calm yet blazing, the kind of stare that says, I know what you're hiding, and I won't let go until it's revealed. The back and forth rose like a tide. Bondi tried to lean into authority, invoking her years as Florida's Attorney General, citing her accolades, her supposed record of fairness. But with each word, the contrast deepened, Bondi reaching backward for credibility, Crockett pulling forward with conviction. You speak of fairness, Crockett said, her voice cutting through Bondi's monologue. Yet when the wealthy and powerful were on trial, you looked the other way. The public deserves to know why. This isn't about politics. This is about justice. The murmurs became a low chorus. Bondi's voice wavered again as she insisted, I have always conducted myself with integrity. But the firmness had drained away. Her posture slumped, shoulders drawing tighter. The mask of authority was eroding under Crockett's relentless steadiness. And Crockett, she didn't raise her voice, didn't pound the table, didn't grandstand. Her power came from the stillness, the way she delivered each question like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples too strong to ignore. She carried herself not just as a congresswoman, but as a vessel of public outrage, a representative of every voice tired of excuses. By now, the entire room was suspended between two forces, Bondi's unraveling composure and Crockett's unwavering resolve. Cameras zoomed in, lenses drinking in every flicker of expression. The air seemed to tighten, breaths caught in anticipation of what would come next. Then Bondi's defense faltered, her jaw clenched, her hands gripped the table, her voice finally betraying the tremor beneath. For a fleeting second, her eyes glistened under the harsh lights. And that was when the shift became undeniable. The polished figure of control had been rattled, undone not by shouting, but by Crockett's steady fire. The room felt it. The gas grew louder, the murmurs heavier. Everyone could see it now. Bondi was no longer untouchable. And Jasmine Crockett, she leaned back slightly, eyes still locked, expression calm but unyielding. She didn't need to raise her voice. She had already won the silence. Then came the single question that shattered Bondi's composure and tied her name to Epstein's shadow forever. The silence before Jasmine Crockett spoke was deafening. Bondi's last defense had crumbled into half-hearted denials, her polished mask slipping. The cameras zoomed in closer, reporters leaned forward, and the hum of anticipation swelled until it became its own sound. A pulsing energy waiting for release. Crockett leaned in, steady, deliberate. Her hands rested calmly on the desk, her face unwavering. When she spoke, her voice wasn't loud. It was low, sharp, and exact, each word dropping like a hammer onto marble. Bondi, she began, her tone even, measured, but carrying the weight of centuries of injustice that had led to this room. During your tenure as Attorney General, did you ever review, intervene, or obstruct the release of records connected to Jeffrey Epstein? The question landed with a silence so profound it felt like the entire chamber had stopped breathing. No shuffling, no murmurs, just stunned stillness. For a split second, Bondi froze, her eyes wide, her lips parting as though the words had knocked the air from her chest. She blinked rapidly, fumbling for composure. Congresswoman, her voice cracked, the honeyed smoothness gone. That is not an appropriate question for this forum. Gas rippled across the room. Members of the committee glanced at one another. The journalists in the press row began scribbling so furiously it sounded like rainfall. Crockett didn't flinch. She let the silence do the work, her gaze unbroken, her body language a portrait of controlled defiance. She leaned back ever so slightly, granting Bondi space to collapse into the weight of the moment. Bondi tried again, clutching at fragments of authority. I have never compromised justice. Any suggestion otherwise is? She stopped, her words tangling into incoherence. Her hand trembled as she reached for the stack of papers before her, shuffling them aimlessly as if the answer might be hiding somewhere in the margins. The microphone picked up the faint rustle, amplifying her panic to the world. Then it happened. The crack in her armor broke wide. Her voice wavered. Her eyes glistened. And under the piercing glow of the cameras, a single tear slid down her cheek. The chamber erupted in whispers and audible gasps. Some committee members shifted uncomfortably, others leaned forward with fascination. For a brief moment, the spectacle of power being undone was almost unbearable to watch. Bondi's polished confidence had disintegrated, leaving only raw, exposed fragility. She pressed her lips together, trying to swallow back the emotion, but her voice betrayed her when she attempted to speak again. Congresswoman, you don't understand the complexities of these cases? She stammered, her words collapsing under the weight of her own unraveling. Crockett, however, remained a fortress. She neither smirked nor gloated. She simply held her ground, dignified, her calm demeanor casting an even sharper contrast to the chaos unraveling before her. Her silence said more than any speech could. This is what accountability looks like. The cameras lingered on the juxtaposition, Bondi crumbling, Crockett unshaken. The image was cinematic, the kind that would replay endlessly on social media within hours. Crockett finally leaned forward again, her voice softer now, but edged with unmistakable steel. The American people deserve straight answers, Ms. Bondi, not evasions, not tears, just the truth. Because when powerful men like Epstein escape justice, it's the public that pays the price. A murmur swept the chamber like a wave. The words pierced deeper than accusation. They carried the force of moral indictment. Bondi opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She reached for her water glass, her hand shaking so violently that the glass clinked against the table before she managed to bring it to her lips. Even that simple motion betrayed the collapse of her composure. Theatrical in its own cruel way, the entire room seemed to tilt toward her, waiting, watching, recording every detail of her unraveling. Her mascara, carefully applied hours before, now threatened to betray her under the glare of the cameras. The very image she had cultivated for decades, polished, untouchable, authoritative, was dissolving in real time. Crockett's calm gaze never wavered. She allowed the silence to stretch, to let the image etch itself into memory. The woman once heralded as the enforcer of Florida law was now visibly broken under the weight of a single question. Japs gave way to murmurs. A few audience members shook their heads in disbelief. The press gallery was alive with flashing lights, every camera desperate to capture the instant of collapse. It wasn't just testimony anymore. It was theater, history, spectacle. Bondi pressed the tissues handed to her by an aide against her eyes, her body shaking faintly as she tried to steady herself. But the damage was irreversible. Crockett had not only disarmed her, she had stripped away the myth of invulnerability that Bondi had carried for years. And still, Crockett did not gloat. She sat there, a picture of composed defiance, shoulders squared, eyes unyielding, embodying the very dignity she championed. Her strength wasn't in raising her voice. It was in refusing to lower her standards. The chamber knew, the country watching knew, the balance of power had shifted in that moment. Crockett had turned a question into a weapon, truth into a mirror, and Bondi couldn't bear the reflection. The seconds stretched like hours. Bondi dabbed at her eyes, her attempts at recovery faltering. Her words stumbled, her voice cracked, her narrative shattered. She was undone. And in that undoing, Crockett rose, not physically, but symbolically. She had become the embodiment of a public's hunger for accountability, the face of a nation demanding to know why justice bent so easily for the powerful, while ordinary citizens bore the weight of the law. When Crockett finally spoke again, it wasn't to twist the knife. It was to remind everyone why they were there. Justice, she said simply, her voice ringing in the chamber like a gavel, is not a favor to the wealthy. It is a promise to the people. The words hung in the air, echoing against the walls, carving themselves into history. Pam Bondi lowered her head, defeated, unable to muster a response. The cameras lingered on her tear-streaked face, then cut back to Crockett's steady expression. Hero and villain, dignity and disgrace, immortalized side by side. The moment felt final, but Crockett knew it was only the beginning. Because the true explosion wasn't in that room, it was in the world outside. The clip spread faster than wildfire. Within minutes of the exchange, Twitter, or what many still stubbornly called Twitter, exploded. Hashtags appeared almost instantly. Fake Crockett vs Bondi, fee tiers of privilege, pops time follows no. By the time the hearing had even adjourned, Crockett's name was sitting atop the global trending list. The 30-second clip of Pam Bondi's tear rolling down her cheek replayed endlessly, stitched onto TikToks, looped in Instagram reels, dissected in YouTube breakdowns. Some paired it with dramatic orchestral music, others with satirical laugh tracks. One viral edit showed Crockett's stare spliced with Bondi's unraveling, overlaid with the words, "Oh, dignity defeats denial." But it wasn't just memes. Commentators from every corner of the political spectrum weighed in. Progressive voices hailed it as a triumph of accountability. Activists called it proof that persistence could puncture the armor of the powerful. Even some centrist pundits, usually allergic to taking sides, admitted the optics were devastating for Bondi. You can't spin that image, one analyst said on a primetime panel. Once America sees you crying in front of the word Epstein, there's no recovering the narrative. Celebrities chimed in, amplifying the moment to audiences beyond politics. A-list actors, musicians, and athletes reposted the clip with captions like, "This is courage," and finally, someone asking the real questions. One pop star with 50 million followers tweeted simply, "Crockett twart Bondi." The retweets piled up in the millions. For survivors of abuse, the moment carried even deeper resonance. Advocacy groups released statements thanking Crockett for daring to ask the questions so many had been waiting to hear. Hashtags shifted from Bondi's collapse to broader demands, pay pentaphiles for justice for survivors. Suddenly, this wasn't just about one woman's tears. It was about a national wound being ripped open again. Bondi, meanwhile, became the subject of relentless ridicule. Late-night comedians pounced, showing slow motion replays of her stammering answers, adding sound effects of crumbling walls or shattered glass. Memes compared her to a corrupt dam springing leaks. It was merciless, but it reflected a cultural truth. Once the internet decided you were a symbol, you no longer controlled your image. And yet, amid the frenzy, Crockett's composure became the defining contrast. Clips of her calm, steady delivery were celebrated as examples of statesmanship in an era of shouting matches. One viral post simply showed a still image Crockett leaning forward, eyes locked, unflinching. The caption read, "This is what leadership looks like." Cable news ran with it for days. Panels dissected the moment frame by frame. Bondi's trembling hands, the shuffle of papers, Crockett's piercing silence. Theatrics aside, the core issue, Epstein's files and who had protected him, was dragged back into the headlines. Editorials demanded accountability. Petition sites surged with signatures demanding the release of every sealed record tied to the scandal. What had once seemed like a buried chapter of American corruption was suddenly alive again. The ripple effect was undeniable. Across the country, ordinary people discussed it at dinner tables, in classrooms, at workplaces. "Did you see Crockett take her down?" became as common a question as, "Did you watch the game last night?" Teachers used the clip to explain civic courage. Parents showed their kids saying, This is why we hold people accountable. And in Bondi's camp, silence. Her office released a half-hearted statement about emotional moments in difficult hearings, but it only fueled more mockery. The image of her collapse was too vivid, too viral, too symbolic to spin away. Crockett, by contrast, didn't race to claim victory. She didn't flood her feeds with self-congratulation. Instead, she let the public carry her message, her restraint reinforcing the dignity people already associated with her. Every repost, every meme, every viral breakdown only magnified the calm force she had displayed. The internet had crowned its victor, but the deeper truth was this: Crockett's moment wasn't about one exchange. It was about reigniting a demand that had gone unanswered for too long. The demand for transparency, for justice, for answers that the powerful had spent decades burying. And yet, what came next would prove that Jasmine Crockett wasn't content to let her victory remain a meme. She understood that a viral moment could fade, but if wielded carefully, it could become something more: a movement, a lesson, a rallying cry. Transition. Yet what Crockett did next transformed this viral moment into something bigger: a lesson for America. When Jasmine Crockett finally spoke after the storm of headlines, she chose her words with the same precision she had wielded in that hearing room. She didn't gloat, didn't bask in the viral fame, didn't reduce the moment to a personal triumph. Instead, she lifted it higher. "This isn't about me," she said, her voice calm but ringing with conviction. "And it isn't even about her. It's about justice. Justice denied, justice delayed, and justice America still demands." Those words reframed everything. In an instant, what had been painted as a clash between two women became something larger, something universal. Bondi's collapse was no longer the headline. It was a symbol of how corruption crumbles when pressed with the truth, how arrogance falters when confronted by dignity. Crockett refused to let the spectacle become small or personal. She widened the lens, placing it where it belonged: on the American people and their right to answers. She spoke of survivors silenced for years, of families who had watched the powerful escape consequence while ordinary lives were torn apart. She reminded the public that Epstein's name was not just a scandal. It was a stain on the justice system itself, a reminder of what happens when wealth buys silence. And in that reminder, Crockett gave voice to the outrage so many felt but rarely heard echoed in the halls of power. Her composure, the calm in the eye of the storm, became more than just a personal quality. It became a metaphor for democracy itself, tested, shaken, but unbroken. Where Bondi had wavered, Crockett stood firm. Where Bondi had tried to deflect, Crockett cut through with clarity. To those watching, it wasn't just a victory in a hearing room. It was proof that truth still had defenders in Congress willing to risk it all for the people. In speeches, in interviews, in town halls that followed, Crockett repeated the same refrain. This is bigger than any single name, bigger than any single scandal. This is about whether America will be a nation where power protects itself or a nation where justice protects the people. It was the kind of language that transformed her from participant to leader, from politician to symbol. She became not just the congresswoman who made Pam Bondi cry, but the voice of a movement hungry for integrity. And people responded. Activists quoted her words at rallies. Survivors of abuse sent letters thanking her for piercing the silence. Ordinary citizens who had never cared about committee hearings before began sharing clips of her testimony with captions like, "This is who we need fighting for us." What Crockett showed wasn't simply the fall of one political figure. She showed that dignity, wielded with discipline, could become a weapon more powerful than any insult or smear. She showed that calm could conquer arrogance, and truth could shake even the most fortified facade. The crescendo of her message built not toward division, but toward unity. She called on Americans to see themselves in the struggle: parents protecting children, workers demanding fairness, citizens insisting on accountability. It wasn't Crockett's fight alone. She made it everyone's. And that's why the moment refused to fade. What began as a viral clash crystallized into a lasting lesson. Crockett had turned a headline into a parable, one about the resilience of democracy, the fragility of corruption, and the unbreakable power of truth spoken without fear. Transition, and that's why this story isn't over, because it now belongs to you. In the end, Crockett vs. Bondi wasn't just a clash inside a committee room. It was a warning shot, a signal to every powerful figure who believes their connections can shield them forever. The moment Pam Bondi broke under the weight of one question was the moment millions saw the truth with their own eyes. Corruption can be exposed, a privilege can be pierced, and justice, though delayed, will always surface. Jasmine Crockett proved that dignity is stronger than denial. Her calm composure stood in stark contrast to Bondi's unraveling, and that contrast will live far beyond a viral clip. It will echo in classrooms, in households, in communities where people are desperate for proof that someone in power still fights for them. But this story doesn't belong only to Congress. It belongs to you. Every share, every conversation, every demand for answers carries the ripple forward. This is how movements grow, not by one person's voice alone, but by millions refusing to stay silent. So if you believe in dignity over corruption, if you believe that truth belongs to the people and not just the privileged, don't let this moment fade. Share it. Speak about it. Join it. Because the fight for justice isn't locked inside Capitol Hill. It's alive in every one of us. And when history looks back on this moment, it won't just remember a congresswoman who made an attorney general cry. It will remember a people who decided that silence was no longer an option. Transition to viewer. This story now belongs to you. Carry it forward.